everyone to today's webinar, Learning at Lunch. This is the third webinar in our four-part series. Today, we'll hear from Blair, an ecologist from Ecosystem Thinking Australia, on farm productivity and building farm natural capital profiles. My name is Razak Shorkar. I'm a land services officer in the Sustainable Agriculture team at North West Local Land Services. I'm also the project manager for valuing natural assets on the farm in Northwest region. This webinar is supported by the Australian government through funding from the Natural Heritage Trust under the Climate Smart Agriculture Program. The acknowledgement. Local Land Services acknowledges that it stands on country which always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and waters, and we show our respect for elders past, present, and emerging. We are committed to providing places in which Aboriginal people are included socially, culturally, and economically through thoughtful and collaborative approaches to our work. Just a bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel for viewing later. We'll also email you the recorded version for your convenience. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the session using only the QA function, not the chat function on your screen. You will find the QA function at the top of your screen next to the chat function. We'll then answer these questions during the QA session. There will be a feedback survey. We want to capture information about your knowledge base before the start of the presentation. So please fill out the pre-event survey, which will show you before the start of the presentation. And there will be a post-event survey, which will show you after the QA session. We value your feedback, and this helps us to deliver the content you like to see in the future. We develop a fact sheet covering key points and links for further resources, which will be emailed to you after the webinar. As mentioned, our today's speaker, Blair. So Liz is an ecologist with Ecosystem Thinking Australia. Liz works as an independent ecologist and facilitator across North West NSW. Most of her work revolves around fauna and flora assessment on working farms. Her passion peaks when working in the forest and woodlands of North West NSW, helping land managers understand their natural ecosystems and perhaps value them in a different way. Liz has worked across the Northwest, based in Inverell, for the last 25 years, previously as a facilitator, ecologist, and manager with CMAs, Catchment Management Authorities, Local Land Services, and the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. Liz lives at Auburn Hill, Inverell, and works in partnership with her husband, Mark, to juggle a small beef operation and run the consulting firm Ecosystem Thinking and spend time with her 3 grown-up boys. Liz is an accredited expert with accounting for nature and has recently started helping farmers prepare natural capital accounts in preparation for the emerging natural repair market. Thank you, Liz. I will now go on to hand over to our today's speaker. But before that, I will just quickly run our pre-event survey, which will pop up in the screen shortly.
While people are finishing that, I just want to thank you for your introduction, Razak. That was very difficult to listen to someone introduce me, but thank you.
Yep. So we got just wait a minute so that people can complete the survey. We've got 3, 4. Yep. Okay. I think most of the people have responded to the survey. So over to you, Liz. Thank you.
No,
Now
no
we'll
problem, Razak. I'll share my
stop.
screen and take
Yep,
over
I'll
from here.
stop
Is that right?
sharing. And yep, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, well, hopefully you can see my screen there. Thank you, Razak, for your great introduction. I won't introduce myself again, but this is a photo you can see on the screen, and hope everyone can see it. It's our place at Auburn Vale. So I hail from Inverell, and yeah, pleasure to be with you today. So today our topic, farm productivity, building farm natural capital profiles. It's a pretty big topic, and what we're just going to try and touch on a few basic elements and go through a bit of what that might look like, talking about measuring, baseline, describing an ecosystem. To do that, we'll talk a little bit about some ecosystem theory. So we'll have a little bit of a session in Nature 101, as well as a little bit of information about how then you could go on and develop natural capital environmental accounts. In particular, I've just got a few slides at the end about the Accounting for Nature framework, which is the accounting framework I'm familiar with. And talk a little bit about how we can score, describe natural ecosystems on farm, and potentially how you can use this accounting framework to track enhancement or restoration efforts. So let's just get cracking and talk a little bit about the topic nature, ecosystems, and focusing very much on farm. So there's this great network of national parks and state forests across Australia, across New South Wales. And then in between are these fantastic pockets of natural ecosystem that are used for perhaps a different purpose, but still have an important function across the landscape. This is a view from our place, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about the journey that I've been on. So I have worked in the past for Soil Conservation Service, catchment management authorities, and local land services, and was very focused in all that time about the soil, water, vegetation. You know, we have this fantastic landscape that we manage, and there's been great steps and improvements in how we manage it. So, you know, ground cover improvement over time has been a big focus of previous organisations I've worked for. But there's a couple of things that I think we've dropped our eye off and now are coming back into focus. And one of them is fauna on farms. A little bit of a journey that we went on just in the drought. We had this colony of sugar gliders that used to live in this patch of woodland at the top of our place. And sadly, due to the impact of 2017 and 2019 drought and then the following fires, that sugar glider colony is no longer there. And it got us thinking about, well, what else is no longer there? What are we losing from our landscape? How does this all relate to farm productivity? Razak's going to put a poll up. I just want you to start thinking about what you understand farm productivity to mean. What comes to mind when you think of farm productivity or productivity? Give you a minute to put a word in the poll. And Razak, maybe you can unmute and just shout out a couple of those as they come up, if you don't mind.
That would be tricky.
Oh, don't worry about that. That's fine. Let's just get you thinking. So put in mind what you think of when you think about farm productivity. What productivity is, and we hear it on the radio all the time. You tune in to Landline, you hear about farm productivity and how we can measure farm productivity and whether it's declining or whether it's increasing. What is it? Well, basically productivity is a measure of the ratio of outputs to inputs. So this ratio changes over time, and that's when people measure. So how much are you putting in compared to how much production are you getting in the end?
Liz, will you be able to see what people responded to the question?
I can if I flick over to the screen.
No, I can just say that for you. So
Okay,
I can
great.
see wildlife efficiency, input, profit, kg beef, output, resilience, and abundance. Yep.
So that's the sort of things people are thinking. So your a measure of farm productivity is used to see whether we are tracking in a certain direction. And one of the inputs into farm productivity is inputs that are free, and they're inputs from nature. And Razak, can you just pop up that next poll?
Yep.
So people can start to think about what some of these inputs from nature would be. So when we're talking about farm productivity, obviously the inputs are things like our labour, things we buy, fertiliser, the machinery that we're putting in. But then our inputs are also some out of our control, but they come from nature. So rainfall, sunlight, the inherent fertility of the soil, they are all inputs. We're not all lucky enough to live on the Liverpool plains with that high nutrient soil, and we're not all lucky enough to live where rainfall is super abundant. So it is natural that farm productivity will vary in different parts of the landscape.
Yep. So yeah, so I got a few responses on that question.
Yeah.
So native grasses, caring for nature, beneficial insects, shade and soil, carbon cycle.
Yeah, perfect. They're all the sorts of things that come from nature. And we can act in a way that enhances that. So what we're thinking about today is how building ecosystem health can increase productivity by enhancing those free inputs from nature. So ecosystems themselves can be enhanced to also be more productive. And that's what I'd like you to think about in the next half an hour as we talk about ecosystems, ecosystem change, describing ecosystems, and measuring and benchmarking ecosystems. In particular, the work that we're involved in is looking at fauna on farms. And there's there is some really good research. There's a reference there, and it's in the fact sheet that you'll get from the Ecological Economics Research Organisation that estimates that overall in the globe, our loss of ecosystem health and the loss of those services that come from healthy ecosystems, they're termed ecosystem services, that it could be up to 10% of global GDP. So if you think about your farm, maybe that's about the same. Productive ecosystems can enhance productivity globally and on your place. So I have a sense that fauna are an important and often forgotten element of this picture. I mentioned that we'd had this drought followed by fire up in the tablelands and Northwest. And what we saw from that was a step change in the condition of the ecosystem. Often what we see in ecosystem health, in the natural world around us, is a gradual decline, and we kind of let that happen and we don't really notice because it shifts. The shifting baseline, that they call that a shifting baseline, is things change so gradually that we accept that as the norm. But what we saw in the drought was a very abrupt change and a loss, and in this case, a loss of species that was permanent unless we want to change it back. All right, let's just talk a little bit about what we're talking about. These are a couple of little photos from our place. When we talk about fauna on farms and ecosystems, the residents of our landscape are not unfamiliar to us. things like your blue-tongue lizard, the little pipit, they live in the same place as we use. So this is a photo from Auburn Hill. And those two photos were taken in exactly the same place as the photo of our beautiful bull and his progeny. Why should we think about fauna further? I think it's important. Personally, I think we have a responsibility. I've put there, we have agency. They don't. As much as you can't believe Disney, they have a couple of movies. Over the Fence, I think, was one where the fauna all got up and took arms up and fought against the humans. That just doesn't happen. If we're not looking after these animals in our landscape, then who is? The other thing is that we don't know what we're losing until it's gone. And we may regret it if they disappear. They may pay us back. We don't know the benefits that some of these fauna have. So we do make time for what we value. And it wouldn't hurt if we place a little bit more value on native fauna. We've got a few photos. Look, this is a project that we've been involved in for Northern Tablelands Local Land Services called Hollow Homes, where we actually go into forests that were affected by the Tingha fires and re-establish hollows using a machine called a hollow hog. So here's a little artificial hollow, and this is a feather-tailed glider visiting it. Another night, we had a sugar glider visiting the same hollow. It's a little bit big for the sugar glider. Another night, the same place, we had a squirrel glider visiting the same hollow. So this is all on an operating farm up on the Tingha Plateau. And you can see in this photo on the right-hand side, there's a little leaf in there. The little feather tails actually ended up making a nest and breeding and have raised young in this artificial hollow that's been inserted. The landholder that we're on had no knowledge that these animals were all existing and living and working in their forest. So it was a fantastic experience and discovery for them. Another project that Local Land Service support, and this is on the upper reaches of the McDonald River, is the Bells Turtle Project, where we're looking at the turtles in the river and trying to encourage landholders to fence riverbanks to protect nests from foxes, so that we end up with recruitment and nesting success in the upper McDonald River. These guys could go unnoticed, but through the actions of landholders, their populations are potentially increasing. And it's really critical that we do this, because what would happen, like, we don't know what would happen if the Bells turtle all disappeared from the McDonald River. And through the actions of landholders, they're increasing. This is another photo, and look, I don't know if you've seen these guys. They occur throughout the North West. This is a landholder sent me this photo. He was so excited that the first time after 4 years after the drought, he'd seen this, I think it's a spotted harrier, and it was hunting across the landscape again after 4 years of drought and grassland and gravelry. What was it hunting? It was hunting the quails, and the only reason that it was present was because the grass was long enough to support populations of quails. So why is all this important? Well, we're talking about, especially in grazing systems, but it's still applicable for cropping systems. Ecosystems, including all those native animals, are the foundation of life. So you track back to high school biology, where we had the food web. Does everyone remember that? Having to draw up the food web and cycles in your biology school book. Taking you back there, it's such a critical component to our farming system, is a functioning ecosystem. So ecosystems are defined as a community of life forms that interact with each other, living and non-living. And they can be big, they can be small, they can be simple and complex, they can be very resilient, or they can be very fragile. They can be very rare or can be common, and they can be natural, modified, novel, which is something new, or something recreated. And we see them all around us. In managing our farms, we're managing ecosystems. This is a beautiful little drawing called Nature's Field Hands, which illustrates in an example of a natural ecosystem. So think about the woodlands, especially of North West New South Wales. There's different layers and different elements, and within each of that, there is different living organisms, from underground right through to the birds in the air. And they each have their own niche and place. How do we value this? How do we recognise it? There's a couple of examples here. Just get your mind thinking of where you drive. There's a roadside examples in the Northwest. On the left-hand side of your screen, you've got a Bimblebox woodland, and on the right, a Mile woodland. Within each of these different ecosystems, there's different vegetation, different shrubs, different animals, and they're all kind of living together within that ecosystem. And in there, and this has again come from our work on the Tingha Plateau, there are some animals which are maybe even more important than others. And they actually, this is a picture in the middle of the yellow belly glider. The picture on the right-hand side is feed marks that they make when they're feeding off the tree. And on the left-hand side, you've got a big fat brush-tailed possum that's taking advantage of these feed marks from the yellow belly glider. So there's a lot of stuff happens in an ecosystem, in natural ecosystems, that goes on out of sight and out of mind at night. Very quickly, a little bit of ecosystem theory. Why are they important? Well, that life-sustaining support from ecosystems just can't be replaced. The role of trees, grasses, to harness energy from the sun through photosynthesis, create soil, stabilise the landscape, allow water to cycle through and produce oxygen, can't be replicated. It's done by nature, and that supports cultures, people, place. There's obviously products we get from ecosystems as well. And on farm, things like timber, fence posts, pastures, resources for our animals, shelter. From the more societal point of view, things like medicines and raw materials come from nature and ecosystems. And then you've got the functions like pollination, decomposition, carbon capture that come from ecosystems as well. So there's a lot of value. There's also value that's perhaps unseen. And look, this is a bit of a side tangent, but one of the little projects we've been involving is trying to capture inputs into the ecosystem, into the soil from animals in a functioning ecosystem on farm. And this is just one of the examples. We saw a quail earlier. We looked at the spotted harrier and said that was an indication that it was a good quail population. In this paddock, in that paddock that you saw where the dog was walking across the long grass, we estimate there's about 25 quail per hectare. And this little calculation shows, if you take into account what they deposit every day and then the nutrient makeup of their manure, which is basically chook poo, then calculated up, you're looking at per hectare a total animal deposit of about 109 kilograms per hectare per year just from quail. I'm going to flick through these numbers quite quickly, but we can come back to the end. That's just a calculation for the quail. And if you're thinking about a functioning ecosystem, reflect back to that ecosystem we saw before, that beautiful drawing. If you've got multiple elements, so here's just 3 additions to this ecosystem. You've got a koala in there, you've got an antechinus, that's the little mouse-looking thing on the hand, and you've got a quail. You can start to say, well, within that functioning ecosystem, each of those animals is contributing and cycling nutrients. And you're starting to see the numbers add up. So the quail's putting in 109 kilograms a year, the antechinus only 24, but the koala, 273 kilograms a year for a koala per hectare. So there is tangible benefits with a functioning ecosystem. We're just not very good at measuring them. I'd recommend this book. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more in a global perspective, this fellow, Simon Musto, has written an excellent book, and I'd highly recommend it. Wildlife in the Balance, Why Animals Are Humanity's Best Hope. It's just a great read, and it opens your mind to perhaps some of those elements of ecosystems that we're just not appreciating or thinking about. Okay, we better keep moving, and I'll just get into describing ecosystems. So we value ecosystems. How do we describe them? And how do we measure them? How do we build natural profiles? I'm going to introduce just a few terms that we'll be using, and it's important that we just run through them so we understand what they are. So benchmarking or reference ecosystems. In Australia, most ecosystems can be benchmarked. So there is a way of describing an ecosystem that's likely to occur in your area. So for example, in our area, we have a lot of grassy white box woodland, and we can describe or benchmark what that should look like in terms of the number of trees, the number of shrubs per hectare, the amount of shade on the ground, the types of grasses that should exist. And those benchmark conditions, they're very important because they're used in a number of schemes. So you might have heard of the New South Wales Biodiversity Offset Scheme. There's the Federal Nature Repair Market, and there's the method of accounting that I'm going to speak to today, Accounting for Nature. They all use this idea of having a reference or benchmark condition. One of the important elements of an ecosystem, and one of the things that gets benchmarked is the number of species that are likely to be found and the species richness. So those different elements, like the number of trees, shrubs, grasses that I mentioned for grassy white box woodland, there's a certain expectation on what you might see in an ecosystem that's really in good condition. And you'd also expect to find certain mammals, birds, reptiles. You'd expect to see a range of insects, and you could even go and say, well, what sort of microbiome might be expected to be present in that kind of ecosystem? And that would be very different. Grassy box woodland, where I live, might be very different to the arid, semi-arid shrublands, and it would be completely different to, say, the rainforest on the coast. So that species richness will vary according to the different type of ecosystem we're talking about. There's a system in New South Wales, and you can look this up online. There's very easy to find a modelled vegetation map. The classification system that's used in New South Wales are called plant community types, and there's over 1,841 at the moment, and they are changing that classification often, so there might be more coming on. So you can look at your area. Here's another little roadside just down near the Liverpool Plains. That would be mapped as, say, Bimblebox woodland, and it would be named according to its features, because it's a woodland because the trees are interspaced a bit further apart. It's not a forest. It's called Bimblebox woodland because it's got Bimblebox as one of the dominant species, and it would be expected to be found on a certain soil type and landscape element. So we use vegetation as one way to describe different ecosystems. And you break that down. There's three very important words which get used when they're describing an ecosystem. One is its composition, what's it composed of. One is its structure. How is it structured physically? Are there upper layers, grass layers, layers in between? And it's also important to look at its function. How is it functioning? For example, is there water present? Is it connected to other patches of vegetation? Is there fallen logs and litter? Is it functioning? Are the components of the ecosystem cycling together? So the reason I'm using these terms is it's very important because when we come to describe, measure and rate ecosystems, each of those little elements will have almost like a checker box to say what's present, and they can have a rating. So we'll come back to that later, but remember those ones. A couple of other little bits of theory about describing ecosystems. There's some terms that it used. So the range of a species, where these ecosystems occur, depends on their natural distribution. Where we're looking at, and we're looking at when you do counting for nature or profiling your ecosystems on farm, looking specifically at endemic species, things that are naturally there. And not all plants occur everywhere. There are some that will occur specifically in locations because of the available moisture type of soils. So yes, you don't find everything everywhere. There's some ecological niches. So some plants really are very specific to a certain set of conditions. Ecosystems change over time, the succession. So what's there now may not be what's there in the future because there might be a disturbance and it's still finding an equilibrium. And then there's some species that are very isolated and occur. There's been breaks in continuity. So isolation is an important thing to describe as well. It's important to recognise that some isolated remnants no longer support that species that once occurred there. Very quickly, we're talking about a system that we don't fully understand yet either. And there's this little great fact checker on the ABC website that says that 75% of Australia's living species are still not known, which means then they might not be described by science. So there's so much to learn and we're still discovering. Okay, now that's a little bit about ecosystems and the natural landscape we're trying to describe. Is there any questions that anyone has before we launch into how you would then rank, measure and do a natural capital profile on these ecosystems? I'll flick over to Razak just in case there are any questions.
No, so you can use the chat function or QA function, or if you like to talk, just raise your hand if you have any question for Liz before we move on.
I'm happy to keep moving on.
Yep.
Okay.
I think we'll maybe save the question for the QA session.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about all this in maybe economic or terms that we don't often use when we talk about ecosystem. We're very, very familiar. Anyone who watches any TV channel is familiar with the idea of home renovation. And we're familiar with talking about homes and houses and buildings as assets and as capital. Here's an example of our old home. The photo on the top with Mark working on the roof is when we first started tearing it apart. And the photo down the bottom was when we'd finished. We had a home that, and the baseline was maybe worth a certain amount of money. And then 5 years later, after improving it, the asset had increased in value. So we're familiar with this concept. Can we look at our natural assets in the same way? The answer is yes, we can, but it's a developing science. So a soil, for example, we all know that there are certain things you can do in practice to improve soil. It can be in a certain state, which could be a baseline. You can put some things in place. 3 years later, you've improved it slightly. And then 5 years later, you've improved it even more. How do you measure that? It's not something you sell on the open market, not like a house, but there are ways you can measure it. And potentially, there are ways you can participate in a market to gain from that increase in condition. Here's an example of an ecological, a site, an ecosystem. On the right-hand side, you've got introduced pasture, minimal native species, isolated trees, and no recruitment. If you were to change that, if you were to implement practices to bring it to a state on the left where you've got much more diversity, you've got less weeds, more shrubs coming, some native plant recruitment, is there a way you can measure and benchmark that? There is this little wheel, I don't know if anyone's come across it before. Ecological restoration is a science. There are some international guidelines for ecological restoration, and you can track how you're going in terms of certain elements. So some of the words we used before on how you would measure an ecosystem, it's possible to track over time. Species composition, your structural diversity, how the ecosystem is functioning. There are things you can measure, and in this wheel on the right, there's an online version of it and in an Excel form, which is an excellent tool for people like this sort of thing. You can track how you're going and look at your improvement over time. But that doesn't give you a score, it doesn't give you a number, and it doesn't help you participate on the market. It is a useful tool though. Accounting for nature, this is one of the emerging frameworks that actually allow you to track and rate and score natural ecosystems. And then as you change and develop that ecosystem, you can track over time and see how that is improving or what your score is doing. So I'll talk a little bit about accounting for nature and then we'll open it up to questions. Accounting for nature is a framework that was developed between 2008 and 2018 by the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists. You might have heard of them before. They're quite important advocates for biodiversity and ecosystem management in New South Wales. It's an independent certification standard that's published online, and there's a website there that you can look to. And there's independent and certified auditors and accredited assessors across Australia. This framework has methods, certified methods, that can be applied to different components of an ecosystem. So they can look at the vegetation, soil, fauna, water, or even down to microorganisms. Methods are basically a statement, 30-page booklet that outline how you would score the condition of those different environmental assets. And you can tailor that to different regions, ecosystems, and apply it really at any scale. The methods also identify what type of expertise is required or expected to be used to implement a method. And it may be that some of these methods can be done on farm by the landholder. Some need someone with a certain level of accreditation. And for the highest level, where you participate in a market, they might need your certified accredited officer to undertake most of the environmental account. This is an example of a method. This is the native vegetation method. It uses those New South Wales plant community types as a benchmark or reference. So for my area, the grassy white box woodland, we would go onto a farm and look at the condition of that woodland, the native canopy height, whether there was subshrubs present, what sort of percent cover there was. They're examples of condition indicators that we would measure. And then there's a formula that you plug all those numbers into, and it calculates this thing called an econ, which is the environmental conditions score. Another method that we use and we apply is the terrestrial mammal method, where we go through a process. This is an overview of the process, and this is a screenshot directly out of the publicly available method that's on the screen there. Basically, you look at the asset boundary, so it may be a farm or a paddock. We go and gather some data. You develop, step 4, some indicators and benchmarks from the method, and then compare. Once you've collected your data, you calculate this condition score called an econ. And at the end of doing the method, you have a little technical report that describes your asset and gives it a score. So here's a little example on Auburn Hill. Here's our boundary. You might choose the whole boundary or just a paddock boundary. In our situation, we map the reference ecosystem, and you can see this map in front has about 7 different reference ecosystems because the landscape varies from east to west, north to south. And for each of those reference ecosystems, you'd put a series of cameras out for the fauna method, and you would determine what fauna were there and get your data. Here's an example. This is a little pocket of grassy box woodland that hasn't been touched for a long time. The fauna that we find in there and the monitoring that happens there may generate you an econ score of, say, 70, whereas a patch like this, which is highly fragmented, isolated, you might generate an econ score of, say, 30. And the reason those scores differ is because your structure, composition, and function of those 2 ecosystems are very different. So that's basically how it works. There is some really good tools and webinars available to learn more about this, and I would highly recommend them. This is just one of them, the AFN terrestrial mammal methodology. So if you're at all interested, this is recommended viewing. You watch these webinars, it gives you a really good introduction to the accounting for nature method and how it's applied. It goes into quite a lot of detail on how the indicators and reference benchmarks are defined and the sources of information. And there's a lot of science behind this that's very new and developing. A lot of these methods have only been around for the last 2 or 3 years. They're in their first version, and they update them as new science becomes available and experts deliver the process. There is some really good information. So in particular with the fauna method, this is an example of our place again, Auburn Hill. According to the Atlas of Living Australia, and search for that, we have no amphibians and only 1 species of mammal. So that's because it's not because the fauna don't live there, but because no one's gone and searched and no one's put any records in the public sphere. Our understanding of fauna and ecosystems on farms is pretty poor. So through this method, you can actually add to the database and search around and learn a lot about your place and learn a lot about the native fauna. Just for interest, the Atlas of Living Australia, this is a search for a 10-kilometre radius, and it reveals a lot more information. I would really encourage, if you're interested in fauna on farms, to log into this website if you haven't come across it before. iNaturalist. It's a citizen science platform that allows people to load information on plants and animals and then seek other interested people to input into that. And it's an excellent platform if you're interested in fauna on farms on your own place. There's a few things I'm just going to skip over, and I can come back to that if there's questions, but accounting for nature and natural capital profiling allows you to do a scientific method to rank your condition as it stands. And then what it also reveals through the process is perhaps which elements are missing. And what you would perhaps learn from the process was how you could increase condition and thereby increase your functioning of your ecosystem. So, for example, it may be different native species that are missing, perhaps understory layers or perhaps herbs and grasses, mistletoes, and those can be added in. Tree hollows, we've done a lot of work adding in tree hollows into areas of the landscape where there's no natural tree hollows, maybe regrowth forests that are 80 years old, and there are things you can do to easily add hollows into your forest. Ground cover, is there fallen timber missing? How's your soil, organic layer? Is there grazing management strategies you can do to increase litter layer, for example? So one of the benefits of doing your an accounting for nature or the natural capital profile is you see where the things are missing and what elements there are that you can change to improve your condition. So in conclusion, look, farm productivity, that's a bit of the topic. Natural ecosystems are never going to be the whole farm, obviously, because the farm is modified to produce ag production. But there are ways that you can look at where your natural ecosystems occur on farm, how that particular area can be improved, measured, and why. So why would you do that? Apart from your own knowledge about what its current condition and what the missing elements are, you may benefit from doing this to demonstrate value to investors or consumers, perhaps now or perhaps in the future, to actually rate, measure, and demonstrate how your natural ecosystems on farm are being managed and being improved. You can combine the Accounting for Nature framework, vegetation, fauna methods with what's called a PCON, which is a productive condition. So there's an econ and a PCON to give an overall farm account. So you could demonstrate through using this method how you are not just improving your ecological condition of your natural ecosystems, but also productive ecosystems and develop an overall farm account. There are some good, if you look at the Accounting for Nature website, there's some good examples of how people have done this. And people do it for different reasons. One of the first things that you're asked to do if you use the Accounting for Nature framework is to define your reason for developing an account. And you can go on the website and look at examples and also find an accredited expert who can support you. If you're just interested, like people are interested for developing farm accounts, but people just have a general interest as well. And there's lots of things you can do if you're interested in fauna on farms. That Atlas of Living Australia is a great search. You'll find that in the fact sheet. Also, you can do a protected matters search to find at a federal level what threatened species are predicted or may occur in your area. As I said, citizen scientists are going crazy in iNaturalist. It's a great place to look if you're interested in linking up with people who are also interested in the same thing. And there's a whole lot of things you can do to just start monitoring on your own place. The Accounting for Nature fauna method talks about how to set up remote camera traps, how to interpret the data. There's lots of really good advice in there. And if you don't want to do a full natural capital account, there's things you can still do on your own. And again, I'd recommend that restoration wheel that I showed before about ways that you can maybe use your own tool to measure and track ecosystem enhancement over time. So that's all I had for now. I did promise Razak I'd leave 10 minutes for questioning at the end.
Thank
and
you,
I'm
Liz.
very happy to go back over anything that I've touched on
Thank
as
you,
I've
Liz. I
flown
was
through.
just keep listening maybe because there's so interesting thing you're talking about. Like it's so not about productivity. There is many things about maintaining the environment or care for the nature, I think. Oh, okay. So
I can
I
see a
think
hand up from Nikki. Hi,
yeah.
Nikki.
Um, Hi, Emma. Can we unmute Nikki?
Yeah, sorry, that was me raising my hand as well. Nikki, I'm just going to try and unmute you. You should be able to just unmute yourself at the top now. Nikki, can you see that? And you should be able to ask Liz a question.
I
Perfect.
think so. Yep.
Yeah, we can
Hello,
hear you.
Liz.
Thanks.
Hi,
Hello.
Nikki. Nice
Hello.
to
What a-
see you.
Yeah, you
Oh,
too. What a
here.
great presentation. Thank you. Liz, is the Accounting for Nature, is that the group that charge quite a lot to have their consultants come out and work with you? I have a sense that we might have done a workshop with them previously and their cost was a little bit mind-blowing, or have I got them mixed up with somebody else?
Yeah, you might have them mixed up with someone else. I'll share my screen again and I'll just show you the website so you can be certain who I'm talking about. Is that all right, Razak? I've just shared my
Yeah.
screen again.
Yep, no worries.
Yeah, so Accounting for Nature this is them here.
Yeah.
So the way Accounting for Nature work, it's an organisation. It is non-for-profit, but they charge for their services. There's a lot of methods. So if you go into their website, you can see where it says framework and you go down to methods. They were the ones I was talking about where you can either do fauna or vegetation or soils or all of them together. They have this expert directory. So this is Australia. It's an Australia-wide organisation. And so if you zoom out, you can see around Australia where people are. So they don't have a big staff. They accredited. So here's me up in Inverell. So that's,
Okay, so you're an accredited assessor with them as well now?
yes, yeah, that's right.
Right,
And there's
okay,
somebody in
great.
Armidale, and then there's people sort of up in Toowoomba. So there's new people popping up as people get accredited. So that's how it works, is that like I'm accredited to use their method and deliver it. And people would engage me to do that. Other people are accredited for different things. So
Right.
that's how their system works. So it might not be the same people you were thinking of because they generally don't have a big staff that do the work themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank
Does
you.
that
Thanks,
help?
Liz. Yeah, thank you. We got another question from Ali Big. So Ali she asks the question. My big question is, how do we encourage farmers to take these concepts on board? And makes perfect sense to me, but seems a hard sell.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It's a hard sell at the moment. So why would someone do this? So you have to have a good reason to do it. There are people who are starting to do it now for commercial reasons, where they're seeing that there are certain industry moves afoot where they're saying in the future they expect, especially things like the European Union, they would expect to see some sort of level of accreditation, or they would see it, the farmer sees a market benefit from having a story to tell about their nature-related disclosures. Like there's a international framework called the Coming Montreal framework, where it talks about nature and nature markets and nature-related disclosures. That's something that we'll probably hear more about in future years as big companies have to report on their impact on nature. So they have to disclose what their impact on nature is. This market is very new though, and it's emerging. So right now, there's no pressing need commercially for a farmer to have this sort of environmental accounting. It may be in the future. So for now, for the people who are getting into this and putting their toe in the water and trying it have a real passion and an interest about it and want to be able to tell a good story. We work with a couple of superannuation companies that want to be able to tell the story to their investors. So that's where the demand seems to be at the moment. But yeah, for selling it and telling people that it's a really good thing to do, I'll be the first to admit it's pretty low on people's priority lists at the moment. Having said that, I think it's really good to start the conversation about some of the production benefits that people can get from just enhancing the ecosystem that they have on farm, like maybe not going to the full natural capital account, but that idea that we can all benefit from improving the function of ecosystems, that's a message that is worth telling over and over again, because I think there's a whole heap of ecosystem function that we're missing out on now that could produce benefits for individual farms.
Thanks. We got another follow-up question from Ali. So currently a space for early adopters. Good to know some super funds are doing it. Agree, we keep telling the story of why. Thanks for great webinar. Thanks, Ali. Thank you so much. So I'm
One
just
thing I will
adding.
just add on to that is that there's also, I think you're going to see the major banks moving probably before individuals as well. They will be a big player in this because a lot of loans in the future, there is international frameworks being implemented at the moment where the banks will be very keen on people who want loans to demonstrate that they're not having a negative impact on natural ecosystems. So watch that space.
Thanks, Liz. So I got a question for you, Liz, sorry, because we are running this webinar as a part of our Climate Smart Agriculture program, which is a project that we are currently running in North West Local Land Services, so which is valuing natural assets on farm. So on that perspective, actually, my question is, so we are working with landholders at this moment, trying to understand more about their farm productivity and how they're managing different natural assets on farm. So my question is, how having fauna on farm will improve productivity? For example, what is the link between having frogs, snakes, birds, or invertebrates, etc., and how can we help? How they can help improve farm productivity?
I think it's a question that science is still struggling to answer and give a quantitative answer to. But there are good intuitive understandings that a balance between native ecosystems, especially in a pasture enterprise, balance between native vegetation and pasture, if you can get the balance right, you can be much more productive overall. The resilience that comes on a farm that has, say, up to 30% native vegetation, that there's a couple of good papers that show that farms that have 30% vegetation are more resilient, more productive overall, because they have that buffer and that the resilience that comes from shade, shelter, water holding capacity. And where you can have strategically placed vegetation along riparian areas, steep areas, you benefit from water holding capacity. The rain that falls on the farm doesn't just all rush off. You actually have a higher water holding capacity overall. And part of where natural areas, natural woodland and forest is functioning in that way, and you have a functioning ecosystem with the snakes, frogs, lizards all in their place, that bush, that landscape can be a real asset in a catchment sense. Where you're just got, say, big dead standing trees and nothing underneath, you're finding the condition of that ecosystem it's not a healthy ecosystem. You may not be getting the full function that you could from a much more fuller, resilient, healthy ecosystem.
No, thank you, Liz. So I think we are running out of time. So
we are out of time.
So I got many questions. Maybe I will ask you offline. This is a really great
that's a challenge
presentation,
with
Liz.
an hour, and I have provided some links. If people are interested, there's a lot to explore in this space, and it's a very emerging. We didn't even touch on the new nature repair market, the federal legislation, and the new environmental protection legislation. There's a whole lot of information there that people can explore in their own time.
Thanks, Liz. We'll just quickly run the post-event survey, and we'll then wrap up this webinar today. So I hope you'll be able to see the survey questions. on the top. So coming up. So yep. Thank you for your time answering these questions for me. Thank you.
Thank you for holding this, Razak, and I'm glad you didn't ask me the question about the snake that you asked me earlier before everyone joined.
I just maybe included that question in my question actually. Thank you.
The snakes also have a role and a function.
Yeah. So
I saw someone clapping there, so whoever that was there.
yeah, that's a great presentation today, Liz. Yep.
Thank you.
No, so I will just give a minute to people who can respond to my poll, and then yep. So yep, I got 4 responses. So yep. All right. Yep, I would like to thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you found something useful. And if you'd like to know more about our project, Valuing Natural Assets on Farm, funded through Australian government under the Natural Heritage Trust through the Climate Smart Agriculture Program, feel free to contact me or to your nearest local land services office in Northwest. And if you'd like to know more about natural capital or need more support managing natural capital on your farm, please contact Andrew Jack, who is our natural capital advisor for Northwest Local Land Services. Yeah, and last but not least, I would also like to invite you to attend our last webinar in this series, which is coming next week. So you will hear from Richard Eckert, who is a professor of carbon farming at the University of Melbourne and science leader in the net zero agriculture project. He'll be talking about farm emission accounting and how to build a farm enterprise farm emission profile. Thank you all for joining us today. So as I said, this webinar has been recorded, so I will send you everyone a copy of that one so that you can watch it later. So thank you, everyone. I will just quickly see if there is anything here, and thank you.